A quiet old waiter lives a simple life in a small restaurant, unnoticed by the world, until a ruthless gang humiliates him, expecting an easy target. But when he finally reveals who he really is, they realize, too late, that they've awakened something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. Carlos Mendez moved through the small neighborhood restaurant with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this job for years. At 67, he had the air of a man at peace with his routine. His uniform, though slightly worn, was always neat. His steps were measured, his hands steady as he carried plates and refilled glasses. The other employees respected him, and the regulars appreciated his courteous nature. The restaurant, El Buen Sabor, was a cozy place, owned by Patricia, a kind-hearted woman in her 40s who had inherited it from her parents. It wasn't a place of luxury, but the food was good, and the atmosphere was warm, the kind of place where people felt at home. Carlos, despite being an employee, was part of that feeling. Every morning he arrived before the sun had fully risen, helping set up the chairs and sweeping the entrance before Patricia unlocked the doors. He never rushed, never showed impatience. If someone asked about his life before working here, he would give vague but polite answers. Carlos preferred things this way, quiet, simple. Yet there were details that set him apart from the average old man. His back never slouched. His movements, while appearing effortless, had a precision that didn't quite belong to a mere waiter, and his eyes, dark, unwavering, constantly scanned the restaurant, catching details others ignored. The way someone reached for a napkin, the tension in a customer's shoulders, the nervous glances exchanged between certain patrons. He noticed everything, though he never let it show. Patricia often teased him about his seriousness. "You act like you're guarding a treasure," she would joke. He would simply smile and shake his head. Old habits. The day progressed as usual. The lunch rush came and went, and Carlos handled everything with the same methodical ease. He wiped down tables, served meals, and listened to the chatter of customers without really engaging in it. He enjoyed their presence but kept to himself. As the afternoon faded, he stepped outside during his break, leaning against the wall beside the entrance. He lit a cigarette, a habit he had never quite managed to give up. The smoke curled into the air as he observed the street. A group of teenagers rode their bikes past, laughing. A stray dog trotted along the sidewalk, sniffing for food. A vendor across the street adjusted his fruit stand. Nothing out of place, just another day. Carlos took another drag of his cigarette, exhaling slowly. This life was a far cry from the one he had lived before. But that was the point. He had built this quiet existence with purpose. He wanted no trouble, no conflict, just peace. Still, he knew peace was never permanent. As he flicked the cigarette away and returned to the restaurant, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Something was coming, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it again. The evening had settled over El Buen Sabor, casting a warm glow from the hanging lights inside. The usual patrons occupied their favorite tables, enjoying their meals with quiet conversations. Carlos moved through the restaurant as he always did, placing dishes with care, refilling drinks, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Then the door swung open with force, breaking the peaceful rhythm of the place. Javier El Flaco walked in first, his tall, wiry frame moving with exaggerated confidence. He was in his early 30s, dressed in a flashy red jacket and worn-out jeans. His slicked-back hair and cocky smirk announced his presence before he even spoke. Behind him, two other men followed, Sergio, heavy-set with a shaved head, and Mateo, thinner but just as menacing. Carlos didn't react. He simply observed. The three moved like they owned the place, their steps slow, deliberate. The restaurant grew tense, customers lowering their voices or avoiding eye contact. Patricia, standing behind the counter, stiffened but forced a polite smile. "Buenas noches," she greeted, her voice measured. Javier didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked around, as if inspecting the establishment. Then, without warning, he pulled out a chair from an occupied table. "Up," he ordered the man sitting there. The customer hesitated, eyes darting toward Patricia. "Didn't you hear me?" Javier's tone darkened. The man stood, muttering something under his breath as he grabbed his plate and moved to another table. Javier laughed, slapping Mateo on the back before dropping into the chair. Sergio and Mateo sat beside him, grinning. Carlos remained where he was, watching. He'd seen this kind before, young men who mistook fear for respect. Javier leaned back, stretching his legs out. "Bring us something good, Patty," he called out using a mocking tone. "We're hungry." Patricia hesitated for half a second before nodding. "Of course." As she turned toward the kitchen, Javier grabbed a handful of sugar packets from the table and began tossing them one by one onto the floor. Sergio laughed and did the same, while Mateo casually tipped over the salt shaker. Carlos exhaled slowly through his nose, his expression neutral as he made his way toward them. Without a word, he crouched and began picking up the scattered packets. Javier chuckled. "Look at this old man," he said, nudging Sergio. "So obedient. Maybe we should leave more of a mess." Sergio grabbed his glass of water and, with a careless motion, knocked it over, spilling its contents across the table. The liquid dripped onto the floor, mixing with the sugar. Carlos didn't react. He simply took a rag from his apron and began wiping the mess. "Damn, I think he likes cleaning," Mateo said, smirking. The customers avoided looking at the scene, pretending not to notice. No one dared to interfere. Javier tilted his head. "You're real quiet, old man. Don't got anything to say?" Carlos straightened, meeting Javier's gaze for the first time. His expression was calm, unreadable. "No," he said simply. Javier narrowed his eyes as if expecting more. When none came, he clicked his tongue in amusement. "Well, isn't that boring?" Patricia returned with their food, setting the plates down quickly before retreating behind the counter. The gang began eating loudly, talking with their mouths full, deliberately dropping food onto the floor. Carlos remained nearby, cleaning the areas they dirtied, his movements steady, patient. But beneath the surface, he was studying them. He noted the way Javier's right hand hovered near his belt, a concealed knife, most likely. Sergio had a tattoo on his wrist, the insignia of a gang Carlos recognized. Mateo kept shifting his gaze toward the door, restless. Carlos had seen men like them before, and he knew that this was not the last time they would come. For now, though, he remained silent, because it wasn't time to act. Not yet. The restaurant had grown quieter, the usual warmth of El Buen Sabor replaced by a heavy tension. Customers ate in silence, their gazes darting toward the three men who had claimed the center of the room. Javier chewed noisily, talking with his mouth full. He laughed at his own jokes, occasionally smacking the table as if he owned the place. Sergio and Mateo joined in, their voices carrying over the subdued atmosphere. Carlos continued working, unbothered, moving from table to table with the same precision as always. But Javier wasn't done with him. "Hey, viejo!" Javier called, dragging out the word, mockingly. "Come here!" Carlos finished wiping a nearby table before turning toward him. He walked over slowly, his face unreadable. Javier leaned back in his chair, smirking. "You been working here long, old man?" Carlos met his gaze. "A while," Javier chuckled. "Must be nice, slow, peaceful, not like the real world." Sergio grinned. "Yeah, bet he just spends his time polishing plates and sweeping floors." Mateo snickered. "Careful, he might get tired, he's ancient." The three laughed, their amusement growing as they fed off each other's energy. Carlos remained expressionless. Javier squinted at him, tilting his head as if studying an animal in a cage. "You don't talk much, do you?" Carlos didn't answer. That only seemed to amuse Javier more. "You remind me of my grandfather. He was all quiet and stiff too." He picked up his spoon and swirled it in his bowl. "But you know what? He was weak, and weak men get stepped on." With a flick of his wrist, Javier tipped the spoon, sending a stream of hot soup spilling onto Carlos's apron. The restaurant fell into complete silence. Patricia's breath hitched. A customer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even Sergio and Mateo hesitated for a moment, waiting for the old man's reaction. But Carlos did not flinch. The burning liquid seeped through his apron, but he merely glanced down at the stain, then back at Javier. His face was calm, unreadable. Javier's smirk faltered slightly. "You gonna do something about it, viejo?" he taunted, leaning forward. Carlos met his gaze with unsettling stillness. For the first time, Javier's fingers twitched, an unconscious reaction to the feeling that something was off. Carlos reached for the napkin tucked in his apron. Slowly, methodically, he wiped the soup from his hands and arms, then folded the napkin neatly before placing it on the table. He said nothing, did nothing. And somehow, that was worse. Javier forced a laugh, though it sounded thinner than before. "Man, you really are just a boring old man." He grabbed his drink, taking a sip before turning back to his friends. "Come on, let's eat. I'm getting tired of this guy." The tension in the room remained. Carlos turned away, moving toward the back of the restaurant. Patricia shot him a worried glance, but he gave her a slight nod, just enough to assure her that he was fine. But as he stepped into the kitchen and out of sight, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not humiliation, something much colder. Something no one in the restaurant had ever seen before. Carlos stood in the dimly lit kitchen, his hands gripping the edge of the sink. The sound of distant laughter from the dining area barely registered in his mind. The scent of spices and grilled meat filled the air, but he smelled something else, something buried in the past. Gunpowder, blood, sweat. His fingers twitched involuntarily. For years, he had trained himself to suppress those instincts, to push the memories away. But the moment the hot soup splashed against his apron, something deep within him stirred. Something he had spent decades trying to bury. Flashback. A different time. A different man. Carlos Mendez wasn't a waiter. He was a leader, a commander in one of the country's elite SWAT units. He had once moved through the shadows, calculated and lethal, taking down criminals with the kind of precision that came from years of rigorous training. Clear. The sound of boots against concrete, the sharp clicks of rifles being raised, the deafening silence before an explosion. A raid. Carlos led the charge, his team sweeping into a cartel hideout. The air was thick with tension, adrenaline coursing through his veins. A split-second decision could mean life or death, and Carlos never hesitated. Gunfire erupted. Enemies fell. Carlos moved with the efficiency of a machine, neutralizing threats one by one. His voice was calm, his commands sharp. But even the best make mistakes. The memory shifted. A mission gone wrong. A hostage situation. The sound of a young officer gasping for air, blood pooling beneath him. Carlos pressing his hands to the wound, trying to stop the inevitable. The mission had been a success, but at what cost? End of flashback. Carlos blinked, forcing himself back to the present. His reflection stared back at him from the kitchen window. A face lined with age, but the same sharp eyes, the same scars. He had left that life behind. He had walked away, swearing never to return to violence. And yet, the way Javier had looked at him, the way he had tried to humiliate him. It wasn't the first time Carlos had faced men like him. He knew the type, the kind that thrived on fear, that saw silence as weakness. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. This was nothing, a minor inconvenience. He had survived worse, but deep down, he knew. A storm was brewing, and peace never lasted forever. Carlos stepped out of the kitchen, his expression as calm as ever. The restaurant still held an air of tension, though the chatter had cautiously resumed. The other customers stole glances at him, expecting some sort of reaction. But there was nothing, no anger, no frustration. Just the same quiet man they had always known. Javier, Sergio, and Mateo continued eating, their laughter forced now, as if trying to reaffirm their dominance over the room. But Carlos had seen it before, the slight stiffness in their posture, the way Javier's fingers drummed against the table. They were waiting for something. Carlos approached their table, moving at the same unhurried pace. He stopped just beside Javier, not close enough to be a threat, but not far enough to be ignored. He picked up a fallen fork from the floor and placed it back onto the table with deliberate care. Then, without looking at Javier, he spoke. "You should be careful." The words were soft, barely above a whisper, but they carried a weight that made the air around them shift. Javier's smirk faltered. "What was that, viejo?" Carlos finally looked at him, his gaze steady. "It's dangerous to underestimate people." A flicker of something crossed Javier's face. Confusion, irritation, maybe even the smallest trace of unease. Sergio laughed, trying to brush off the moment. "He's giving you life advice now." Javier forced a grin, leaning back in his chair. "That so?" He grabbed his glass, taking a slow sip before slamming it down onto the table. "And what happens if I don't listen?" Carlos didn't answer. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned and walked away. Javier's grin remained, but it was thinner now, less certain. Patricia, who had been watching from behind the counter, hurried over to Carlos as he reached the back of the restaurant. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice hushed. Carlos nodded. "I'm fine," she hesitated. "They won't stop coming. You know that, right?" Carlos sighed. He did know. Javier wasn't the type to let something go. Men like him needed control, and Carlos had just shaken that. Patricia bit her lip. "Maybe you should take the night off. Just go home." Carlos considered her words. She wasn't wrong. There was no point in pushing things further tonight. "All right," he agreed. He untied his apron and set it down on the counter. As he stepped out into the night, the cool air greeted him. The streets were quieter now, most businesses closing for the evening. He took a deep breath, walking at his usual steady pace. But as he turned the corner, his instincts stirred. Something wasn't right. The shadows felt heavier. The air felt different. And though he couldn't see them, he knew someone was watching. The following evening, El Buen Saber buzzed with its usual energy. Customers filled the tables, their conversations blending with the clatter of dishes and the sizzle from the kitchen. The previous night's events lingered in the back of everyone's minds, but no one spoke of it. They hoped, perhaps foolishly, that it had been a one-time disturbance. Then the door swung open. Javier walked in first, a slow, deliberate stride. This time his smirk was gone. His eyes scanned the room, not searching, claiming. Behind him, Sergio and Mateo followed, their faces set in something colder, more dangerous. The restaurant fell into a tense silence. Carlos, wiping down a table near the counter, didn't need to turn to know they were back. He had felt their presence before they even stepped inside. Javier pulled out the same chair he had taken the night before, but instead of sitting, he kicked it aside, letting it crash against the floor. Patricia flinched behind the counter. "We're eating for free tonight," Javier announced, his voice louder than necessary. "All of us." Sergio laughed, moving toward a table where an older couple sat. Without a word, he snatched the man's plate and began eating from it with his bare hands. The woman gasped, clinging to her husband's arm. Mateo, meanwhile, wandered toward another table, picking up a drink and pouring it onto the floor. "Oops," he muttered, smirking. Carlos set his cloth down and turned around. Patricia's eyes met his, full of silent warning. Javier grinned when he saw Carlos finally acknowledge them. There he is, the wise old man. He stepped forward, tapping his fingers against the counter. "Say, viejo, still think I should be careful?" Carlos didn't answer. He simply looked at him, his expression unreadable. Javier's smile twitched. "What's wrong? Not in the mood to talk anymore?" Sergio slammed his empty plate onto the table. "Hey, old man, we made a mess. Why don't you clean it up?" He kicked a chair over for emphasis. Mateo knocked a few utensils onto the ground, laughing. "Yeah, get to work." Carlos exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. He turned to pick up a tray, moving toward the nearest fallen items. Javier clicked his tongue, disappointed. "That's all? I expected more after your little warning last night." He stepped closer. "I think you need to understand your place, viejo." Then he shoved Carlos. It wasn't a hard push, but it was intentional, meant to humiliate. Carlos barely moved, his feet planted firmly. Javier frowned. "What? You didn't even stumble." He pushed again, harder this time. Still, Carlos remained unmoved. The room was deathly silent now. The other customers sat frozen, watching. Carlos slowly turned his head, locking eyes with Javier. And then, in a single motion, he moved. His left hand shot up, gripping Javier's wrist with precision. Before the younger man could react, Carlos twisted, just enough to send a sharp jolt of pain through Javier's arm. Javier gasped, his free hand reaching for his belt. Too late. Carlos stepped in, shifting his weight. His right arm struck with practiced efficiency, knocking Javier's knife from its sheath before he could draw it. The blade clattered to the floor. Sergio and Mateo barely had time to register what had happened before Carlos turned his attention to them. With a swift, calculated motion, he sidestepped Sergio's charge, using his own momentum against him. In the blink of an eye, Sergio was on the ground, gasping for air. Mateo hesitated, but only for a second. He swung wildly, but Carlos ducked, catching his wrist mid-strike. A sharp twist sent Mateo stumbling into a table, knocking over plates and glasses. The entire restaurant stared, stunned. Carlos stood in the center of it all, his posture unchanged. His breathing was steady, his face unreadable. And for the first time, Javier looked up at him with something that wasn't arrogance. It was fear. The restaurant was silent. Javier, still on the floor, stared up at Carlos with wide eyes. Sergio groaned, struggling to push himself up, while Mateo clutched his wrist, his expression twisted in pain and confusion. Carlos remained still, his stance relaxed, yet there was an undeniable presence about him now, one that no longer matched the humble waiter they had mocked. The way he had moved, the precision of his strikes, the ease with which he had neutralized them, it was unnatural. Javier clenched his jaw, anger flickering in his gaze. He had underestimated this old man. And now, with the entire restaurant watching, he had been humiliated. Carlos stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. He crouched beside Javier, lowering himself just enough to meet him at eye level. No es personal, he murmured, his voice even. Pero tampoco es un juego. Javier swallowed hard. Carlos reached down, picking up the fallen knife. He turned it over in his hand, inspecting it with the detached curiosity of someone who had held far deadlier weapons. Then, without looking, he flipped it, pressing the handle against Javier's chest. A message. Javier hesitated before taking the knife, his fingers trembling slightly. Carlos gave him a final glance before standing. Sergio and Mateo exchanged uncertain looks, their confidence shattered. The restaurant's patrons sat frozen in place, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Patricia, who had been gripping the counter with white-knuckled hands, exhaled slowly. Carlos turned, stepping away, as if the moment had already passed, as if nothing had happened at all. Javier's breathing was heavy, uneven. He wanted to say something, to regain control of the situation, but no words came. Carlos picked up a cloth and wiped the counter, the same quiet efficiency as always. But no one saw him as just a waiter anymore, and he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Javier's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his knife, the weight of it suddenly unfamiliar. His mind raced, struggling to reconcile what had just happened. A simple old man, a waiter, had taken him down in seconds. Sergio and Mateo had managed to stand, but neither moved. The entire restaurant remained frozen, all eyes locked on Carlos. Carlos, on the other hand, looked completely unbothered. He had returned to his usual position behind the counter, wiping his hands on a rag as if nothing had occurred. His breathing was steady, his posture relaxed. Javier clenched his jaw. No, he refused to let this humiliation stand. With a sharp breath, he shot up from the floor, shoving the chair aside. "You think you're tough, viejo?" His voice was loud, but there was a slight tremor beneath it. "You think you can just—" Carlos moved, not aggressively, not forcefully, but with terrifying certainty. In a blink, he was in front of Javier, stepping into his space, his presence overwhelming. The younger man instinctively recoiled, but Carlos didn't touch him. He simply leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "I know men like you." Javier stiffened. "I've seen your type before," Carlos continued, his tone calm. "You think fear is power, that making people flinch gives you control." He tilted his head slightly. "But I see you now." Javier swallowed. "And you're afraid." The word struck deep, sharper than any blade. Javier wanted to protest, to shove Carlos away, but his body wouldn't move. He couldn't speak. Carlos took a step back, his eyes never leaving him. "Leave." It wasn't a threat. It was a command. For the first time in his life, Javier obeyed. He turned sharply and stormed toward the door, shoving it open with unnecessary force. Sergio and Mateo hesitated only a second before rushing after him. The door swung shut behind them, leaving only a stunned silence in their wake. The tension in the restaurant lingered for a moment before finally breaking. A few murmurs rose from the patrons. Someone let out a breath they had been holding. Patricia, still standing behind the counter, stared at Carlos with unreadable eyes. "What?" she whispered, searching for the right words. "Who are you?" Carlos didn't answer. Instead, he picked up a fallen chair, set it back in place, and calmly went back to work. But he knew. This wasn't the end. He had let something slip, something that could never be taken back. And now, the past was beginning to wake. The night had fallen over El Buen Sabor, and yet, the air inside the restaurant remained thick with the weight of what had transpired. The usual warmth had returned, but it was different now, less innocent, more uncertain. The customers slowly resumed their conversations, but every so often their eyes flicked toward Carlos. He noticed everything. Patricia had been staring at him for several minutes, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. She had known Carlos for years, yet tonight she realized she had never really known him at all. "You should close early," Carlos said, his voice quiet but firm. Patricia blinked, pulled from her thoughts. "You think they'll come back?" Carlos nodded. "Not tonight, but soon." She hesitated before sighing. "I don't understand, Carlos. What you did back there, no ordinary man moves like that." Carlos met her gaze. "I was never ordinary." Silence stretched between them. Patricia wanted to ask more, but something in his eyes stopped her. Instead, she gave a small nod and turned to the remaining customers. "We're closing early tonight," she announced, forcing a polite smile. "Please finish up when you can." A few murmurs of understanding followed, and soon, the restaurant began to empty. Carlos untied his apron and placed it neatly on the counter. "I'll walk you home." Patricia shook her head. "No, I'll be fine." But then, as if realizing who she was speaking to, she sighed. "Thank you." Carlos gave a small nod before stepping outside. The cool night air greeted him, but it did little to calm the feeling in his chest. He had spent years keeping his past buried. Years pretending to be nothing more than a quiet, unassuming man. But tonight had changed everything. His steps were slow as he walked home, his mind wandering to places he had long tried to forget. Another night, another life, a mission in the dead of winter, the howl of the wind, the crunch of boots against gravel, the cold weight of a rifle in his hands. His team moved like shadows, their presence undetected. The order had been clear. Take them out, leave no trace. Carlos had never hesitated back then, but he had paid for it. End of flashback. He sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. That life was gone. Or so he had thought. As he approached his small apartment, something prickled at his senses. A familiar, unwelcome feeling. He was being watched. He didn't turn his head, didn't change his pace, but he knew someone was there. And then, just as he reached his door, he saw it. A small folded note, wedged between the frame and the handle. His fingers closed around it, and as he opened it, a single sentence greeted him. "We know who you are." Carlos exhaled slowly. So it had begun. Carlos stared at the note in his hand, the weight of the words pressing into his chest like a stone. "We know who you are." He had spent years ensuring that no one would ever connect him to the man he once was. He had changed his name, his life, and his purpose. He had let his past dissolve into the shadows, believing that if he remained quiet long enough, it would never find him again. But it had. The question was, who had left the note? Carlos scanned the darkened street, his senses sharpening. The silence felt unnatural now, almost staged. No movement, no shifting shadows. Whoever had been watching him was already gone. He exhaled slowly, folding the note and slipping it into his pocket before unlocking his door. He stepped inside, locking it behind him, then moved through the small apartment with quiet efficiency. It was a modest place. A small couch, a wooden table, a neatly arranged bookshelf. A life stripped of excess, designed to blend into the background. But now it wasn't enough. Carlos crossed the room and opened the hallway closet. Behind a row of neatly hung jackets, his fingers found a hidden latch. A soft click and a small compartment slid open. Inside lay an old, weathered case. He pulled it out, placed it on the table, and unlatched it. The contents stared back at him. His past, preserved in steel and leather. A handgun, meticulously maintained despite years of neglect. A knife, its handle worn from use. And beneath them, a faded badge. The symbol of a life he had walked away from. Carlos ran a hand over the objects, his fingers lingering on the badge. He had sworn never to pick up a weapon again, never to be that man again. But now, he had no choice. The knock on the door was soft but deliberate. Carlos's eyes snapped toward it, his hand instinctively moving to the gun. He didn't draw it, not yet, but he was ready. Another knock, slower this time. He moved soundlessly, his steps controlled. With his left hand, he unlocked the door, but didn't open it. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," a deep voice said from the other side. Carlos recognized it instantly. Slowly, he pulled the door open. A tall man stood in the dim light of the hallway. His features were sharp, his dark eyes unreadable. He wore a long coat, his stance relaxed. But Carlos knew better. He had seen this man move before. "General Ruiz," Carlos said, his voice even. Ruiz gave a small smile. "It's been a long time, Mendez." Carlos didn't invite him in. "Why are you here?" Ruiz's gaze flickered past Carlos as if scanning the apartment. Then his expression hardened. "Because you made a mistake." Carlos's grip on the doorframe tightened. Ruiz stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You should have stayed in the shadows. You should have let that boy humiliate you. But now you've been seen." Carlos's jaw clenched. Ruiz exhaled. "They're coming for you." Carlos studied the man before him. Years ago, they had worked together, side by side. Ruiz had been his superior, the man who had sent him on missions that had defined his existence. But Ruiz had never been one to act without reason. "If you're warning me," Carlos said slowly, "it means you still think I'm valuable." Ruiz's lips twitched. "You always were." Carlos narrowed his eyes. "Who are they?" Ruiz's expression darkened. "The people you fought before, the ones you put behind bars, dismantled, destroyed. You think they forgot you?" Carlos had known deep down that his past was filled with loose ends. He had done things, necessary things, that had earned him powerful enemies. And now, they had found him. Ruiz reached into his coat, pulling out a small, folded document. "I need you back in the field." Carlos let out a dry chuckle. "I'm retired." Ruiz sighed. "You were never retired, Mendez. You were waiting." He held out the document, and now the waiting is over. Carlos didn't take it. Instead, he turned, walking back inside. He heard Ruiz follow, shutting the door behind him. Carlos gestured to the open case on the table. "I was hoping I'd never have to use these again." Ruiz glanced at the weapons. "And yet you never got rid of them." Carlos stared at the gun. It felt heavier now, not in weight, but in meaning. "If I do this," he said quietly, "I do it my way." Ruiz nodded. "That's the only way you've ever done anything." Carlos picked up the gun, testing its weight in his palm. His fingers moved over it with the familiarity of an old friend. Then he looked at Ruiz. "When do we start?" Ruiz smirked. "We already have." Strength isn't always loud, and power isn't always visible. Carlos lived in the shadows of his past, choosing peace over violence, until the world forced him to remember who he truly was. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't the enemy in front of you, but the one who underestimates you. Now I ask you, if you were in Carlos's place, would you have stayed silent or would you have fought back sooner? Click on the video on the screen to continue your journey of self-discovery and see more stories that challenge the way we think about strength and identity. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another lesson. See you in the next video.